Europe, which is hello in the Jandai language spoken on Quandamooka country, the land of the rivers and seas around Moreton Bay and Minjerribah, or North Stradbroke Island, which is where I live, that area. The land on which we meet today is that of the Yagara and Turrbal people. My name's Anna McCormack. I'm from IWD Brisbane Meanjin, and I want to welcome you to this event, Do Women's Lives Matter? I'll begin by acknowledging that we meet on Aboriginal land, the lands of the Yagara and Turrbal people, lands that were taken by force, the ownership of which has never been ceded and never negotiated by treaty. I'd like to pay our respects to the elders past, present and emerging. I also acknowledge the activists, elders and leaders of the global women's liberation movement, currently a very small but determined bunch of networked women. We stand on the broad shoulders of women before us, and we will do them proud. IWD Brisbane Meanjin makes a contribution by holding the annual feminist IWD rally, as well as hosting a monthly discussion group that analyses the current attempts by government and big corporations to erase women's rights. I'd like to especially acknowledge that yesterday, many women around the country talked about women's oppression and women's liberation. Chalk About It was an initiative of the feminists from Reasons to Riot. It replaced the annual Reclaim the Night rallies. Reasons to Riot is one of our sister allies. Thank you. Today, we'll hear from three well-informed, knowledgeable women. And we'll have a little culture in the form of a poem by Taylor McGowan and the reading of a children's picture book. Two of our three speakers will address particular aspects of the harms caused to women, lesbians and girls by the current political orthodoxy that asserts that trans-identified men are women and that women are a second-rate subcategory of our own sex. Narissa Scott will look at the erasing by policy capture of women's and girls' sports, and Dr. Helen Waite will consider the hostility towards lesbians and the attempts to impose compulsory heterosexuality on them. But the efforts by trans ideologies extremism to turn back women's advances is not by any means the only focus of our politics. One of the very many others is the raft of injustices meted out to women and children by the Family Court of Australia, women and children who've often been the victims of male violence. So we invited Amanda Geary to provide some insight on this. So three speakers, two on gender identity ideology and one on a related area. One of the frustrations for feminists at the present time is that we must put so much of our energy into countering trans-extremist ideology because most women can't or won't. And trans ideology has captured government in this country, so it's an uphill battle for us. It's evident in public and community policy. It's evident in legislation passed at federal and state levels, including in Queensland. Feminist analysis demands that we invest greater effort into other issues: men's violence against women, the prostitution and trafficking industry, poverty and homelessness, the violence of porn, rape and sexual assault, surrogacy, etc. And yet, trans ideology must be resisted and overcome if we're to address these issues. It underpins legislative and policy response to all of them. If we can't talk about the biological reality of sex, then we can't address sexism. We can't challenge patriarchal power. The irony is that it's the most radical and left-wing of feminists who are fighting to retain rights that all women thought we'd won decades ago. Public women's toilets, women's change rooms, domestic violence shelters for women, etc. Because so many women have been silenced by threats of rape, death, job terminations, loss of social networks, etc., and by demands that they put men first, always. So it's left to the most radical to fight for the retention of things that we've come to take for granted, but are disappearing at a rapid rate. 3 things we need to be clear about before we hear from our speakers. 1. In Australia, as in the UK, there's a high degree of social acceptance of trans-identified people. That is, sympathy for and inclusion of people with gender dysphoria. The current aggressive attempts to undermine women's rights will eventually only erode that social acceptance. 2. Where there's hostility to people with gender dysphoria, it comes from violent men, not feminist women. 3. No liberation movement seeks to remove fragile rights from an oppressed people. Women and girls are an oppressed sex class, subjected to men's violence, the denial of reproductive rights, high degrees of poverty and homelessness, etc. Gender ideologues are not a liberation movement. They're largely men who seek to remove women's rights, and they're directed by the clever captains of the pharmacological and medical industry pursuing profit. Now to the first of our 3 speakers.